well in terms of trying to unpack
Mhm.
the a world order still structured by what you have always emphasized as this domination subordination dynamic in so
Mhm.
many aspects of our lives, humans and humans and the earth. What I wanted to start with is in some ways how I kind of discovered you and started to really admire you and your work was through the book Citizens of the Empire: The
Mhm.
Struggle to Claim Our Humanity, and particularly as a brown Muslim in that post 9/11
Mhm.
environment, I found very little resources, books, etc., that could really explain uh, well, they could say in a sophisticated, but at least in a very political way of what the problems are in
Mhm.
the world. And now when we mean political, I mean in a very expansive sense of how the political damage that we're doing, not just to each other, but to the earth and so on and so forth. And that book was, I mean, for me, and I'll be very honest, I think the top three books that I would then distribute after 9/11 were, of course, Chomsky's 9/11. Mahmoud Mamdani had a good book, Good Muslim, Bad Muslim,
Mhm.
The US, the Cold War, and the Roots of Terror. And it was your book. And quite frankly, I found your book to be the best because it was very accessible. It really it spoke to Americans about, look, this is
Mhm.
in some ways what's going on, why the anger or hatred or whatever is being festered throughout the world. And this is not about religion. This is not about theology. This is about a whole lot of other issues that are impacting us. So I wanted to give that long-winded kind of intro of how I discovered your work, and not just then through the kind of
Mhm.
the imperial framework of looking at the world and seeing that inequality, but also then through that seeing other forms of domination and subordination
Mhm.
dynamics in areas of certainly race
Right.
and gender and so on. So, Bob, for our audience, I know that book is. I still think it's like it's all around me. It's like published yesterday, but that Citizens of the Empire. Is it possible to kind of recollect that period and the context in which
Yeah.
the ideas of that book emerged?
Sure. Maybe I can start by pointing out that uh, I've often said this when I've talked about my books. It seems a little odd at first, but uh, I can guarantee there's not a single original idea in any of my books. And the reason I say that is to point out that people before me have sketched out these power dynamics and gone into great detail. Historians, political scientists, activists. And if I've done anything useful, it's simply to put into plain language uh, uh, the kind of theory that often is inaccessible to ordinary people. So I take that as a great compliment that Citizens of the Empire achieved that. Uh, I was born in the United States and badly educated, like most of us. So it wasn't until I was about 30 years old that I actually started to think about power in a serious way. It's kind of embarrassing to admit that, but it's true. And my original academic work was in feminism, the feminist critique of sexual exploitation. And that helped me understand this, what you mentioned, this domination subordination dynamic, centrally in relationships between men and women, patriarchy, kind of the foundational social oppression, helped me understand that that dynamic plays out in all sorts of other relationships. And from there, it was simply a question of moving through them. And one of the first ones, just perhaps by accident, was the role of the United States in the world. Now, prior to that, I would have thought, well, the United States has done some bad things. The Vietnam War wasn't very bright. What you might call a traditional liberal critique of bad actors. And through the reading and the activism that I engaged in, I started to understand it's more systematic. And at the heart of it was the dire need to understand the United States not as the vehicle for freedom and democracy around the world, which is what I grew up hearing, but in fact an imperial project, an imperial power that went around the world pretty much the way empires do. maximizing its own wealth and power through whether it's military, economic, or diplomatic power. All right. Well, by the time 9/11 came along, that was a very useful framework to understanding that yes, terrorist attacks on civilians are, beyond defense, but that the United States response was going to be devastating, devastating not only to the individuals who were underneath the bombs that were falling, but to the world more generally, including to ordinary people in the United States. So I was part of a network of people who responded very quickly after 9/11. And if you remember back all those years, it was not well received. We were supposed to think of the United States as an innocent victim that had a right to go destroy other societies. And so it was a
Although
real
I do
struggle.
think I do think you mentioned how much the president of your university loved what you had to say.
Yeah, I did get in a little bit of trouble, although compared to the current political climate, what went
Yeah,
on back
good
then
point.
seems almost tame. Uh,
Good point.
but I think the thing to focus on was in Citizens of the Empire, I tried to take apart, in a sense, the bad education I had received in the United
Mm.
States. So there's a chapter, for instance, in which I examine the phrase that you hear all the time from US politicians, whether they're Republicans, Democrats, whatever, that the United States is the greatest nation on earth. I grew up with that and had internalized that. And the minute I started thinking critically about it, realized it was a crazy notion for several reasons. One is that no nation can claim to be the greatest nation on earth. It's an absurd claim. Nations are good and bad on a number of dimensions. And the second was, of course, that the record of the United States didn't really lend itself to the claim of being the greatest. So that was where Citizens of the Empire came from. It came from my own need to educate myself, as an adult, to kind of overcome the education or the miseducation I'd had as a child. And it also came through organizing, through being involved in local and loosely organized national groups, which is, of course, Junaid, how you and I met. And so, as you said, I've kind of tried to move through these various systems and structures of power, whether it's the sex gender system and sexual exploitation, or the role that first world nations, especially the United States, play in maintaining inequality around the world. Of course, then you can't talk about that without talking about race and the legacy of 500 years of white supremacy. All of these are crucial. Eventually, you start talking about economics and the wealth inequality inherent in capitalism. And finally, in my more recent work, taking more seriously the question of what I call the multiple cascading ecological crises, not just climate change, but a host of forces that really make a long-term, large-scale human presence on the planet no longer a given. And that's kind of a summary of what I've done. I've been lucky to have the opportunity to do that both as a teacher and as a writer, but more important, as a member of organizing communities, mostly local. And I think that's where a lot of education really happens. At least it did for me. Not just reading books and paying attention to theory, but getting engaged on the ground to try and understand how the world really works.